She was Hollywood's brightest smile until it vanished in fire above the Nevada desert. Carole Lombard wasn't just a star. She was a comet who blazed across the golden age of Hollywood, a force of nature known as the Queen of Screwball Comedy. With a famously foul mouth and a heart of gold, she redefined the role of women on screen, becoming one of the highest paid and most beloved actresses of the 1930s. Her life had three distinct dramatic acts. First, a story of unbreakable resilience. After a horrific car accident nearly ended her career before it began, she fought her way back from the bottom rung of the industry to its absolute pinnacle. Second, a story of epic love. Her marriage to Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, was the stuff of legend, a passionate, funny, and deeply authentic partnership that created the ultimate Hollywood fairy tale. Finally, her story is one of patriotic sacrifice. As World War II erupted, Lombard threw herself into the war effort, becoming the nation's most glamorous and effective fundraiser. It was on a flight home from a triumphant war bond tour in January 1942 that her plane went down, killing all aboard. Her tragic death at age 33 didn't just break the heart of a king, it shook a nation at war, cementing her legacy as a vibrant talent and a true American hero. This is the story of that brilliant life, that legendary love, and that final patriotic flight. To understand the singular magic of Carole Lombard, you first have to understand the world that forged her, a world of dramatic, convulsive change. She entered it on October 6, 1908, not as Carole Lombard, but as Jane Alice Peters, born into a comfortable upper-middle-class family in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was a world teetering on the brink of modernity. The horse and buggy still shared the streets with the sputtering new automobile. Life was governed by the rigid social conventions of the Victorian era, but the seismic shocks of a new century were beginning to crack the foundations. Her father, Frederick, was the son of a wealthy hardware merchant. Her mother, Elizabeth Bess's Knight, was a strong-willed, independent woman, the daughter of a prominent local lawyer. From the very beginning, the Peters household was a place of emotional extremes. Frederick and Bess had a passionate but volatile relationship, and their home life was often a mixture of loving affection and tense whispered arguments. Young Jane, the youngest of three children and the only girl, grew up navigating this landscape, learning early on how to use charm and humor as both a shield and a sword. But more than anything, she was a tomboy, a wild child who seemed to have been born with an irrepressible fire in her soul. While other little girls were playing with dolls and attending tea parties, Jane was climbing trees, organizing street baseball games, and getting into fistfights with the neighborhood boys, often alongside her older brothers, Fred Jr. and Stuart. Her mother, Bess, a woman ahead of her time, actively encouraged this independence. She saw in her daughter a kindred spirit, a refusal to be constrained by the stifling expectations placed upon women. Jane wasn't just allowed to be a tomboy, she was celebrated for it. It was this upbringing, this freedom to be loud, competitive, and utterly herself that laid the foundation for the fearless, uninhibited performer she would become. The first great upheaval in her life came in 1914. After a particularly difficult period, her parents separated. Bess, seeking a new life in a climate that might improve her health, packed up her three children and, like so many others with dreams in their eyes, boarded a train heading west to California. Los Angeles in the 1910s was a sun-drenched boomtown, a sprawling landscape of orange groves and dusty boulevards where a new, strange, and intoxicating industry was taking root, the moving pictures. It was a town built on reinvention, a perfect place for a woman like Bess Peters to start over, and an even more perfect place for a girl like Jane to grow up. Her entry into this dream factory was pure, unadulterated chance, a fable so perfect it could have been written by a studio publicist. At age 12, the story goes, she was playing baseball in the street with her brothers when a car pulled up. The man inside was the pioneering film director, Alan Dwan. He was in pre-production for a film called A Perfect Crime and was taken by this energetic, pugnacious girl with a mop of blonde hair and a fiery spirit. He saw something in her, a natural, uncoached charisma. He asked her to come to the studio for a screen test. She passed with flying colors and was cast in a small but significant role. Just like that, without an ounce of ambition or a single acting lesson, Jane Alice Peters was in the movies. The experience was a thrill, but it was just a lark, a fun story to tell her friends. The idea of it being a career couldn't have been further from her mind. But as Jane blossomed into a teenager in the heart of the Roaring Twenties, the allure of Hollywood became harder to ignore. She was a quintessential flapper, attending dance contests, going to parties, and soaking up the heady, rebellious atmosphere of the jazz age. After dropping out of high school, she decided to give acting another more serious try. Her beauty was undeniable. She had a stunning figure, expressive blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. It was enough to get her noticed. In 1925, at the age of 16, she landed a contract with Fox Film Corporation. They changed her name, first to Carole, and then to Carole Lombard. The transformation had begun. Yet, in these early years, she was just another pretty face in a sea of aspiring starlets. The studio didn't know what to do with her. They cast her in a series of small decorative roles in westerns and adventure films. She was the damsel in distress, the pretty girl on the hero's arm. There was no hint of the comedic genius that lay dormant within her. She was beautiful, yes, but generic. There was nothing to suggest she would one day be a queen. Then, just as her career was beginning to gain the slightest bit of traction, it all came crashing down, literally. In 1926, Carole was out on a date with a young man named Harry Cooper. As they drove along Santa Monica Boulevard, their sports car was struck by another vehicle. The impact was violent. Lombard, sitting in the passenger seat, was thrown forward, her face smashing through the glass of the windshield. The immediate aftermath was a scene of horror and panic. She was rushed to a hospital, bleeding profusely, her face horribly lacerated by a deep gash that ran from the side of her nose down her left cheek. In the unforgiving calculus of 1920s, Hollywood, a star's flawless face was their entire fortune. An injury like this wasn't a setback. It was a career death sentence. When the executives at Fox heard the news, their response was swift and brutal. They immediately canceled her contract. At just 18 years old, Carole Lombard's dream was over before it had truly begun. For any other young woman, this would have been the final, tragic curtain. The moment they packed their bags and took the train back home, forever haunted by what might have been. But Carole Lombard was not any other young woman. She was a fighter. The same scrappy, defiant spirit that had defined her as a tomboy on the streets of Fort Wayne now rose up to meet the greatest challenge of her life. She refused to be a victim. She found a forward-thinking surgeon and underwent one of the earliest forms of plastic surgery, a painful and painstaking procedure with no guarantee of success. Over a period of months, the wound was slowly stitched and treated. When it healed, it left a scar, a faint silvery line on her left cheek. It was barely visible to the naked eye, but under the harsh, revealing glare of a studio Klieg light, it was a canyon. Instead of letting it defeat her, she decided to outsmart it. She spent countless hours in front of a mirror, studying her own face with the intensity of a scientist. She learned every angle, every contour. She became a master of makeup, developing her own techniques to conceal the scar. More importantly, she became an expert in lighting, learning precisely how to position herself so that the camera would never catch the imperfection. This horrific ordeal didn't break her, it forged her. It transformed her from a naive starlet into a hardened professional. It gave her a resilience, a technical knowledge, and a ferocious determination that would define the rest of her career. She had faced down the worst the world could throw at her and had refused to blink. Now she had to start her career all over again from the very bottom. The road back was humbling. No major studio would touch her. Her damaged face made her a risk. The only work she could find was at the margins of the industry. She signed a contract with Mack Sennett, the undisputed king of comedy, whose studio was famous for its chaotic, low-budget slapstick films. For a young actress who had been groomed for glamour at Fox, this was a significant step down the Hollywood ladder. Sennett's studio wasn't a place of art. It was a factory of frantic, physical comedy. It was the home of the Keystone Cops and the Bathing Beauties. Lombard was cast as one of Sennett's Bathing Beauties, a troupe of pretty girls in daring swimsuits, who were often the decorative backdrop for the male comics' antics. It was grueling, unglamorous work. The days were long, the gags were often painful, and the pay was minimal. She was subjected to an endless barrage of pratfalls, pie fights, and high-speed chases. It was the absolute antithesis of the sophisticated stardom she had once dreamed of. Yet this slapstick academy, this baptism by seltzer bottle, turned out to be the single most important training of her career. It was here, amidst the mayhem, that the future Queen of Screwball Comedy found her true calling. She wasn't just another pretty girl standing on the sidelines. She threw herself into the physicality of the work with the same athletic abandon she had brought to childhood baseball games. She learned the brutal, precise mechanics of physical comedy from the ground up. She learned how to take a fall without hurting herself. She learned how to take a pie to the face with an almost balletic grace. And most importantly, she learned about timing, that mystical split-second instinct that separates a cheap laugh from comedic genius. She was honing her craft in the toughest school in Hollywood. She was no longer just a pretty face with a scar. She was becoming an athlete of comedy, a skilled technician who understood how to use her body to make people laugh. The scar had forced her down a different path, and that path, unexpectedly, was leading her directly toward her destiny. She just didn't know it yet. As the 1920s roared to a close, Lombard left Sennett's comedy factory and began a slow, painstaking climb back up the Hollywood ladder. She signed with Pathé Exchange and appeared in a string of dramas, melodramas, and romantic pictures. She was working constantly, taking any role she could get, proving her reliability and professionalism. But the most significant event of this period wasn't a role, it was a revolution. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged the nation into the Great Depression, and almost simultaneously the arrival of sound, the talkies, shattered the foundations of the film industry. The Depression created a deep, desperate hunger for escapism. Audiences didn't want to see their own grim realities reflected on screen. They wanted to be transported. They craved laughter, glamour, and stories of hope and resilience. The advent of sound, meanwhile, created a new kind of star. It was no longer enough to have a beautiful, expressive face. Now, a star needed a voice, personality, and the ability to deliver clever, fast-paced dialogue. For many silent legends, it was the end of the line. For Carole Lombard, it was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Her voice was a revelation. It wasn't the high-pitched, delicate whisper of many of her contemporaries. It was a husky, expressive instrument that could handle a witty retort as easily as a heartfelt declaration. She could talk as fast as she could think, and her years in slapstick had given her a physical dynamism that was electric on screen. The pieces were all falling into place. The world needed to laugh, and Hollywood needed a new kind of heroine, a woman who was tough, funny, glamorous, and utterly modern. The stage was set. All it needed was its leading lady to step into the spotlight. Carole Lombard had emerged from the wreckage of her early life as a survivor. The physical scar on her face had become an internal map of her own resilience, and the humbling knockabout world of Max Sennett had unknowingly armed her with the comedic weapons she would one day use to conquer Hollywood. But survival is not stardom. The journey from the bottom rung of the slapstick ladder to the pinnacle of sophisticated comedy was a long and arduous one. To complete it, she would need to navigate the technological revolution of sound, find a new kind of laughter the world desperately needed, and enter into a transformative marriage with a man whose intellect and elegance would help shape the queen she was about to become. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Carole Lombard found herself at a crossroads. She had survived. The scar on her face was now a testament to her resilience, and her time in the chaotic trenches of Max Sennett's Comedy Factory had forged her into a seasoned professional. She was no longer the fragile, wide-eyed starlet whose career had almost been destroyed before it began. She was a veteran, a graduate of the School of Hard Knocks, armed with an intuitive understanding of comedic timing and a work ethic that was second to none. The new decade, with its dual crises of economic depression and technological revolution, would demand a new kind of star, and Lombard, hardened and hungry, was ready for the fight. She found a new home at Paramount Pictures, a studio known for its sophisticated European sensibility, a stark contrast to Sennett's lowbrow slapstick. Here, she began the slow, steady process of rebuilding her career. The roles were better, the budgets were bigger, and she was sharing the screen with established stars. Yet, for the first few years, she was still largely typecast. She was the elegant clothes horse, the alluring romantic interest, the sophisticated society woman. She was good at it. Her innate grace and stunning figure made her a natural fit for these parts, but there was a disconnect. The fiery, funny, and slightly crazy woman her friends knew off-screen was nowhere to be found in these poised, polished performances. She was playing a part and playing it well, but her true explosive talent remained capped, simmering just beneath the surface. It was during this period of professional ascent that her personal life took a significant turn. She fell in love with and married one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, William Powell. On the surface, they were an odd couple. Powell was the epitome of urbane sophistication. He was dapper, intellectual, and possessed a dry, understated wit. Lombard was a vivacious, uninhibited whirlwind of energy who swore like a sailor and loved practical jokes. He was 14 years her senior, a man of quiet dignity and refined tastes. She was the life of every party, a woman who famously declared, "I love everything that's bad for me." Yet, their connection was deep and genuine. Powell was captivated by her raw honesty and intelligence, seeing past the boisterous facade to the sharp, inquisitive mind beneath. For Lombard, Powell represented a stability and intellectual grounding she had always craved. He introduced her to classic literature, encouraged her to read, and treated her as an intellectual equal, not just a beautiful blonde. Their home became a salon of sorts, a place of lively debate and conversation. Their marriage in 1931 was a union built on mutual admiration and deep affection. However, the very things that drew them together also in time pulled them apart. Their fundamental energies were simply mismatched. He preferred quiet evenings at home with a good book. She thrived on noise, chaos, and a house full of people. She once famously said, "I feel that if I live to be 100, I'll never be grown up." Bill, on the other hand, was born grown up. After just 2 years, they made the difficult decision to divorce. But in a town built on scandal and acrimony, their separation was a remarkable anomaly. It was entirely amicable. They remained the closest of friends, their mutual respect and love untarnished. The marriage had been a crucial chapter in her life, a period of immense personal growth. But her great professional transformation was still to come, and it would be orchestrated by a visionary director and a legendary, half-mad co-star. The year was 1934. The film was 20th century. Her co-star was the great John Barrymore, a titan of the stage and screen, but also a man in the grips of a spectacular alcoholic decline. He was notoriously difficult, a volatile genius who could be brilliant in one take and incoherent in the next. The director was Howard Hawks, a master filmmaker known for his lean masculine style and his uncanny ability to draw naturalistic performances from his actors. The role Lombard was offered was that of Mildred Plotka, a lingerie model whom Barrymore's egomaniacal Broadway producer Oscar Jaffe transforms into the star Lily Garland. It was a demanding high-wire part, requiring an actress who could be both a mousy nobody and a grand theatrical diva. On the first day of filming, Lombard approached the role, as she always had, with poised, polished professionalism. She delivered her lines with perfect diction and hit her marks with precision. Hawks watched for a few hours and then pulled her aside. What he said to her would change the course of her career and of film comedy itself. He told her, essentially, to stop acting. He said he'd seen her off camera, how she kicked her feet, shouted, and waved her arms when she was angry or excited. "I want you to do that in the picture," he said. He asked her what she would do if a man like Oscar Jaffe said a particularly outrageous thing to her. She replied, "I'd kick him right in the shins." Hawks's response was simple. "Well, do it." It was as if a dam had burst. Hawks had given her permission to unleash the real Carole Lombard, the wild, uncensored, and furiously funny woman who had been hiding behind years of controlled, conventional performances. She didn't just rise to the occasion, she attacked it. She went toe-to-toe with the formidable Barrymore, matching his theatrical thunder with her own chaotic lightning. She wasn't intimidated by his legend or his tantrums. She screamed, she kicked, she bit. She threw herself into the physicality of the role with the fearless abandon of her Max Sennett days. In one scene, after a particularly vicious tirade from Barrymore's character, she drew a pin and jabbed him squarely in the backside. The yelp he let out was reportedly genuine. The result was a performance that was nothing short of a revelation. It was a comedic explosion, a tour de force of sublime, unhinged energy. The film itself wasn't a huge box office hit, but for those in the know, it was a seismic event. Carole Lombard had found her voice, or rather she had finally been allowed to use the one she'd had all along. With 20th century, a new genre was born from the ashes of the Depression, the screwball comedy. And it had just been crowned with its first and perhaps greatest, Queen. Screwball wasn't just slapstick with sound. It was a sophisticated, subversive genre perfectly tailored for its time. It was a pressure valve for a society on the brink. These films were characterized by their lightning-fast, overlapping dialogue, their farcical situations, and their battle of the sexes plots, which often featured strong, independent women who were more than a match for their male counterparts. Crucially, they almost always involved a clash between the rich and the poor, satirizing the lives of the idle wealthy and celebrating the common sense of the working class. It was a fantasy, but a relatable one. And at its heart was the screwball heroine, a character Lombard embodied more perfectly than anyone. She was often eccentric, sometimes dizzy, but always intelligent, resilient, and in control of her own destiny. Having found her comedic footing, Lombard solidified her reign with a string of classic films, but her masterpiece, the film that would cement her legacy and earn her an eternal place in the comedic pantheon, was 1936's My Man Godfrey. The film paired her once again with her ex-husband William Powell. Their real-life history and deep, abiding affection created an on-screen chemistry that was pure magic. There was a warmth, a trust, and a playful intimacy between them that no amount of acting could replicate. Lombard played Irene Bullock, the youngest daughter of a fabulously wealthy, utterly eccentric New York family. She is the quintessential dizzy dame, a flighty, spoiled socialite who seems to float through life in a bubble of blissful ignorance. During a society scavenger hunt, she finds a forgotten man, a homeless individual named Godfrey, living in a city dump. In a moment of whimsical inspiration, she decides to hire him as the family's new butler, setting in motion a chain of events that hilariously exposes the moral bankruptcy of her own class. The role of Irene could have easily been a caricature, an air-headed annoyance, but in Lombard's hands, she became something miraculous, an enchanting, deeply sympathetic, and utterly lovable human being. Lombard's genius was her sincerity. She played Irene's most absurd moments with a wide-eyed earnestness that made them not just funny, but heartbreakingly endearing. When she decides she's in love with Godfrey and pursues him with the relentless, single-minded focus of a heat-seeking missile, you laugh at her audacity, but you also root for her. There is no malice in Irene, only a pure, chaotic life force. Lombard's performance is a masterclass in comedic range. In one moment, she is doing a flawless, goofy imitation of a gorilla to cheer someone up. In the next, she is having a mock hysterical fit on the floor, only to dissolve into genuine, heartbreaking tears when she thinks she has lost the man she loves. The film was a colossal success, one of the biggest hits of the year. It perfectly captured the zeitgeist, offering both escapist fantasy and sharp social commentary. It earned 6 Academy Award nominations, including one for Lombard for Best Actress. It was her first and only Oscar nomination, a long overdue recognition of her unique genius. She didn't win. She lost to Louise Rayner for The Great Ziegfeld. But it didn't matter. With My Man Godfrey, she had reached the pinnacle. She was no longer just a movie star. She was a beloved American institution. Her reputation within the industry was just as golden. On set, she was the ultimate professional, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. But she was also famously one of the gang. She detested the star system hierarchy and treated every grip, every electrician, and every makeup artist as her equal. Her famously profane language was not an act. It was the dialect of the film crew, and they loved her for it. She was known for her incredible generosity, often helping crew members with medical bills or financial troubles, and she was a legendary prankster, turning her film sets into playgrounds of joyful chaos, constantly trying to make her co-stars break character by cracking jokes or making funny faces just off camera. She was, in short, adored. She was at the absolute zenith of her career, the undisputed queen of Hollywood. But her personal life was about to be turned upside down by a man as famous, as powerful, and as formidable as she was. A man whose On-screen magnetism was matched only by his off-screen reputation, a man they called the King. Her first encounter with Clark Gable had been years earlier, in 1932. They were cast opposite each other in a steamy but largely forgettable film called No Man of Her Own. At the time, the timing was all wrong. She was still happily married to William Powell, and Gable was unhappily married to his wealthy, older second wife, Rhea Langham. There were no sparks. In fact, there was a palpable friction. She found him stuffy, arrogant, and overly conscious of his burgeoning stardom. He thought she was beautiful, but also a bit of a loudmouthed know-it-all. The on-screen passion was pure performance. As a gag gift, at the end of the shoot, she sent him a large cured ham with his picture plastered on it. It was a playful jab, a not-so-subtle suggestion that she found him to be a ham actor. He reportedly found it hilarious. They parted ways, their paths not destined to cross again in any meaningful way for 4 long years. That all changed on a fateful night in January 1936. The occasion was the ultra-exclusive White Mayfair Ball, an annual charity event hosted by the legendary agent and man about town, Myron Selznick. The theme that year was a symphony in white, and the strict dress code dictated that every guest, from their shoes to their hair, be clad in white. It was the kind of stuffy high society event that Lombard typically loathed. But she decided to attend, and in true Lombard fashion, she decided to make an entrance. Instead of arriving in a white Rolls-Royce, she showed up in a gleaming white ambulance. With sirens wailing, 2 white-clad attendants carried her into the party on a white stretcher, where she gracefully rose to greet the astonished guests. The stunt was the talk of the evening, and it certainly got Clark Gable's attention. He was there, separated from his wife, looking impossibly handsome and slightly bored. He saw Lombard across the room, and this time he saw something different. He wasn't looking at a co-star. He was looking at a vibrant, hilarious, and utterly fearless woman. He asked her to dance. As they moved across the floor, something ignited. The witty, sarcastic banter they had shared on set was still there, but now it was charged with a palpable electric current. He was drawn to her complete lack of pretense, her irreverent humor. She discovered that beneath the manufactured persona of the King of Hollywood was a down-to-earth man who loved hunting, fishing, and getting his hands dirty. They talked for hours, they laughed until their sides hurt, and by the end of the night they had fallen hard. He drove her home, but she didn't invite him in. According to legend, she simply gave him a kiss and sent him on his way, leaving him wanting more. Their romance quickly became Hollywood's worst-kept secret. They were inseparable, but it was a complicated affair. Gable was still legally married to Rhea Langham, a shrewd and formidable woman who was not inclined to give her famous husband an easy divorce. Gable's studio, MGM, was terrified of the potential scandal. They went to extraordinary lengths to control the narrative, planting stories in the press and trying to keep the lovers out of the public eye. But their passion was too big to hide. They were two larger-than-life personalities who had found their perfect match, their other half. She was the only person who wasn't intimidated by him, the only one who dared to challenge him. She called him Pappy. He called her Ma. They were on the cusp of becoming the most famous couple in the world, but there were still obstacles to overcome. The king and queen had found each other, but the fairy tale was still waiting for its happy beginning. With her raw talent finally unleashed, Carole Lombard had done more than just find her voice. She had become the defining voice of a new genre, rightfully crowned the undisputed Queen of Screwball Comedy. Professionally, she was at the peak of her powers. Personally, she had ignited a romance with Clark Gable that captivated the public, and promised a love story for the ages. But how does a secret affair, conducted in the shadows and under the constant threat of scandal, transform into one of history's most celebrated marriages? The next chapter of their story is not about stolen glances at industry parties, but about the real, costly, and complicated process of building a life together, a journey that would lead them from tense, backroom negotiations to a dusty Arizona town, and finally to a rustic sanctuary they would call home. As the mid-1930s unfolded, Carole Lombard and Clark Gable were not just falling in love, they were becoming a phenomenon. In a town built on illusion, their romance felt thrillingly, intoxicatingly real. They were two of the most famous people on the planet, yet their connection was forged not in the glare of the Klieg lights, but in a shared love for the simple, unpretentious things in life. They were a perfect paradox. Hollywood's most glamorous couple who hated the phoniness of Hollywood. But their path to domestic bliss was not a simple one. It was a messy, complicated, and incredibly expensive journey, navigated under the watchful, nervous eye of the most powerful studio in the world. The primary obstacle was Gable's wife, Rhea Langham. She was a wealthy, shrewd Texas socialite, 17 years his senior, who had guided his early career and was not about to be cast aside without a fight. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 2 excruciating years. Rhea knew the value of the man she was married to, and she knew that his studio, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was desperate to avoid a messy scandal that could tarnish the image of their biggest male star. This was especially true as Gable was about to embark on the biggest film of his career, and arguably of all time, Gone with the Wind. The role of Rhett Butler would make him an immortal, and a public adulterous scandal was the last thing MGM's formidable chief Louis B. Mayer was prepared to tolerate. So, the studio intervened. In a series of tense backroom negotiations, a deal was struck. MGM effectively paid for Gable's freedom. Rhea Langham was awarded a settlement of over $500,000, an absolutely astronomical sum in 1939, equivalent to nearly $10 million today. It was one of the costliest divorces in Hollywood history. The king had paid a king's ransom for his queen. For Gable, who was notoriously careful with his money, the financial blow was staggering, but the price was worth it. He was finally chai. On March 29, 1939, in the middle of the grueling production of Gone with the Wind, Gable had a day off. He and Lombard decided not to wait another minute. There would be no lavish Hollywood wedding, no grand ceremony with 1,000 guests. That wasn't their style. Instead, they climbed into Gable's Ford coupe, drove 300 miles across the desert to the small, dusty mining town of Kingman, Arizona, and were married by a justice of the peace in a simple, unadorned ceremony. Lombard wore a simple gray flannel suit. Their witness was a local townsman recruited at the last minute. The whole thing was over in minutes. Afterwards, they celebrated with coffee and sandwiches at a local diner before getting back in the car and driving home. The King and Queen of Hollywood had tied the knot with all the pomp and circumstance of a Tuesday afternoon errand. It was for them absolutely perfect. When they returned to Los Angeles, Lombard orchestrated a surprise for the press, who had been hounding them for months. She called a press conference at her home. When the reporters and photographers arrived, she greeted them at the door, looking radiant. Behind her stood Clark Gable, grinning from ear to ear. "Well," she announced, "the most sensational romance of the century is over. We're married." The news exploded. The fairy tale finally had its happy beginning. Their first act as a married couple was to build a sanctuary, a fortress against the world they both, in their own ways, despised. They purchased a 20-acre ranch in the then rural San Fernando Valley town of Encino. It wasn't a palatial estate, it was a working ranch with a modest, unpretentious farmhouse, a dilapidated barn, citrus groves, and acres of alfalfa. They called it simply the farm. This was not just their home, it was their Eden, the place where the king and queen could finally take off their crowns and just be Ma and Pa, the affectionate, slightly goofy nicknames they had for each other. Life at the farm was a world away from the sound stages and searchlights. Their days started at dawn. Gable would be out on his tractor, tending the fields, while Lombard, dressed in old slacks and a bandana, would be feeding the chickens, collecting eggs and tending to her garden. They had cows, horses, and a menagerie of dogs. They were, by all accounts, blissfully happy. This rustic, simple life wasn't a publicity stunt. It was the most authentic expression of who they were. Gable, who had grown up poor, found a deep satisfaction in working the land, and Lombard, the former tomboy, was in her element, reveling in the freedom to get her hands dirty. Their life together was built on a foundation of riotous laughter and breathtakingly blunt honesty. She was the only person on earth who could deflate his ego. She delighted in mocking his king of Hollywood status, constantly playing pranks to keep him grounded. After he returned from the triumphant premiere of Gone with the Wind, a certified screen immortal, she had a giant, unflattering picture of him from his early, awkward days, as a struggling actor blown up and hung in their living room. Pinned to it was a note, "Don't let it go to your head, Pappy." He, in turn, adored her for it. He loved her fire, her intelligence, and her complete lack of artifice. Their famous gag gifts to each other became the stuff of Hollywood legend, each one a testament to their unique, playful bond. After a particularly awful day on set, he came home to find his car filled to the roof with hay. Another time, after they had a silly argument about his hunting skills, she presented him with a custom-made set of hunting gear, all in delicate pink satin. He, in turn, once gifted her a custom-built miniature fire engine after she had a small kitchen fire, a playful jab at her notoriously bad cooking. This wasn't just joking around, this was their love language, a constant, joyful affirmation of their deep understanding of one another. They rarely socialized in the conventional Hollywood sense. They avoided the big parties and premieres whenever possible, preferring to host small, informal gatherings at the farm for a tight-knit circle of friends, including director Victor Fleming and fellow actor Spencer Tracy. These evenings weren't about industry gossip, they were about playing cards, telling dirty jokes, and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. She was a famously inventively profane woman. Her swearing was an art form, a constant, colorful stream of curses that could make a hardened film crew blush. But it was never vulgar. It was just an expression of her boundless, uncensored energy. Gable and all their friends found it endlessly endearing. While their personal life was a rustic idyll, their professional careers were at an absolute peak. Gable was the biggest male star in the world, the undisputed box office champion. Lombard, now Mrs. Clark Gable, was in a position of incredible power. She had become one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, earning nearly $500,000 a year. She had conquered comedy, and now she used her clout to stretch her artistic muscles, taking on challenging dramatic roles in films like Made for Each Other with James Stewart and the medical drama Vigil in the Night. She longed to be seen as more than just a comedian, to prove the full range of her talent. And while these films were not always massive commercial successes, they earned her a new level of critical respect. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, there was a quiet, persistent ache, a deep, unfulfilled dream that cast a shadow over their happiness. More than anything in the world, Carole Lombard wanted to be a mother. She and Gable tried desperately to have a child. They consulted the best fertility specialists, and she underwent a series of painful and invasive treatments, all to no avail. The official reason given was a vague inability to carry a child to term, but the result was a recurring cycle of hope and heartbreak. This private struggle was a profound source of sorrow, particularly for Lombard. She poured her maternal instincts into her friends, her stepson, Gable's son, Judy Lewis, from an affair with Loretta Young, a fact that was a closely guarded secret at the time, and her animals. But the longing for a child of her own was a constant, quiet grief. It's a poignant, often overlooked dimension to their story. The couple who seemed to have everything were denied the one thing they wanted most. This shared vulnerability, this secret sadness, perhaps bound them even more tightly together, deepening a love that was already legendary. And as Ma and Pa built their fortress of love and laughter at the farm, the world outside their gates was growing darker. The late 1930s saw the ominous rise of fascism in Europe. The newsreels that preceded their comedies in cinemas were filled with increasingly terrifying images. Nazi rallies in Nuremberg, the annexation of Austria, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. A storm was gathering, a storm that would eventually break upon the shores of their own, seemingly safe, American paradise. In America, the prevailing mood was one of staunch isolationism. The trauma of the First World War was still a fresh memory, and the vast majority of the country wanted no part in another European conflict. But in Hollywood, a community with a large population of European émigrés who had fled persecution, the anti-Nazi sentiment was strong and growing. Stars and studio heads formed committees, raised money for refugees, and began producing films with subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, anti-fascist messages. Carole Lombard was at the forefront of this movement. She was a passionate vocal Democrat and a fervent supporter of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. She followed world events with an intensity that was unusual for a Hollywood star, her conversations often turning from industry gossip to the dire political situation in Europe. She had no patience for isolationism, which she saw as a dangerous head-in-the-sand delusion. She believed that America had a moral duty to stand up to tyranny. Her patriotism was not a fashionable pose. It was a deeply held conviction, a core part of who she was. This passionate belief, this powerful sense of duty was solidifying within her, waiting for a catalyst, a moment when she could translate her words into action. As 1941 drew to a close, life at the farm continued its idyllic rhythm. Ma and Pa were deeply in love, their bond fortified by shared joys and private sorrows. They were the king and queen of a dream world, living out their own perfect dream. But the rumble of distant thunder was growing louder. They, along with the rest of America, were living in the final, deceptively peaceful moments of a world that was about to be changed forever. The calm before the storm. Ma and Pa had built their private Eden. Against the backdrop of Hollywood's artifice, the Encino Ranch was a monument to their authentic love, a place of simple joys, riotous laughter, and a deep, abiding partnership, fortified by both shared dreams and private sorrows. Their fairy tale was real, but no wall, not even one built of love and laughter, could hold back the tide of history. As the world outside their gates spiraled into a devastating war, their personal story was about to be swept up in a global drama. The passionate convictions of the Queen would soon face the ultimate test, demanding a journey of patriotic duty that would challenge her spirit, strain her legendary love, and ultimately ask for the ultimate sacrifice. Be continued. In the final months of 1941, the Encino Ranch was a world unto itself, a fortress of love and laughter sealed off from the growing anxieties of the world. For Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, life had settled into a rhythm of comfortable domesticity, a private dream they had painstakingly built together. Their careers were flourishing, their love was a deep and abiding comfort, and their home was a sanctuary. But no fortress is impregnable. As the year waned, the ominous drumbeat of war grew louder, a distant rhythm that was about to become a deafening, shattering roar. The idyllic world of Ma and Pa was living on borrowed time. On the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, that time ran out. The news of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor ripped through the nation's peaceful Sunday morning like a shockwave. It was a moment of profound collective trauma. The distant war was no longer distant. It was here. America was attacked, vulnerable, and furiously, vengefully angry. Across the country, the response was instantaneous. The bitter divisions between isolationists and interventionists dissolved overnight, replaced by a surge of unified patriotic fervor. In Hollywood, the reaction was just as swift. The Dream Factory, almost overnight, became an arsenal. Production schedules were altered, studios began churning out propaganda films, and the once frivolous community was gripped by a solemn sense of purpose. Some of its biggest names walked away from their contracts and headed straight for the nearest recruitment office. Jimmy Stewart, already an accomplished pilot, was one of the first to enlist, trading his movie star salary for that of an Army Air Corps private. He was followed by a wave of others: Henry Fonda, Tyrone Power, Ronald Reagan. The message was clear. In this fight, everyone had a part to play. For Carole Lombard, the news of Pearl Harbor was not just a national tragedy. It was a personal call to arms. The political passion that had been simmering within her for years now boiled over into a ferocious desire for action. She was consumed by a restless energy, a feeling of utter impatience with the glitz and triviality of her own profession in the face of a world crisis. While others were wringing their hands, she was demanding to know what she could do. She immediately threw herself into the work of the newly formed Hollywood Victory Committee, an organization designed to coordinate the film industry's war effort. But attending meetings and planning events wasn't enough. She needed to be on the front lines, in her own way. Her chance came in a direct request from the highest office in the land. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration was launching its first major domestic initiative of the war, the Defense Bond Program, soon to be known as war bonds. It was a massive undertaking designed to raise the billions of dollars needed to fund the war machine. To kick it off, they needed a spokesperson, someone with immense popularity, credibility, and a patriot's fire. They needed someone who could unite the country and open its wallets. They chose Carole Lombard. The plan was for her to return to her home state of Indiana, the heartland of America, and headline the first official war bond tour. For Lombard, it was the role of a lifetime, a chance to translate her deeply held convictions into tangible action. She accepted immediately, her enthusiasm boundless. There was, however, one person who was vehemently opposed: her husband. Clark Gable was horrified by the idea. His reaction was visceral and immediate, a mixture of protective fear and a traditionalist belief that a war zone, even the home front, was no place for his wife. He was filled with a chilling, unshakable premonition of dread, begging her not to go. The days leading up to her departure were filled with a tense, simmering conflict that finally erupted into one of the worst arguments of their marriage. It was a fight born not of anger, but of love and fear. He saw the dangers of cross-country travel in wartime, the unpredictable crowds, the grueling schedule. He reportedly pleaded with her, "Oh, babe, for Christ's sake, you're not a soldier." But she was immovable. In her mind, this was her form of enlistment. This was her duty, as clear and as binding as any man's. Her friend and agent, Myron Selznick, later recalled that her determination was absolute. She felt that if she, with her fame and influence, didn't do everything she possibly could, she would be failing her country. The argument ended in a painful stalemate. She was going with or without his blessing. Their final moments together before she left for the train station were not filled with the warm, loving banter of Ma and Pa, but with the cold, heavy silence of unresolved conflict. It was a farewell that would haunt Gable for the rest of his life. In early January 1942, Lombard, accompanied by her mother, Bess Peters, and Otto Winkler, a veteran MGM press agent and close friend of Gable's sent along to keep an eye on things, boarded a train and headed east. The presence of her mother was a source of comfort for Lombard, but also of a quiet, underlying friction. Bess was a devout follower of the Baha'i faith, a believer in spiritualism, and a woman given to premonitions. She also had a deep, abiding fear of flying, a phobia that would soon become a tragically pivotal factor. The tour itself was a stunning, unqualified triumph. From the moment she arrived in the Midwest, Lombard was a whirlwind of patriotic energy. The people of Indiana greeted their native daughter as a returning hero. There were parades, rallies, and an endless series of public appearances. She was indefatigable, delivering fiery, off-the-cuff speeches that were a potent cocktail of Hollywood glamour and Hoosier plain-spokenness. She connected with the crowds on a deeply personal level, not as a distant movie star, but as one of them. The tour culminated in a massive rally on the night of January 15th at the Cadle Tabernacle in Indianapolis. Thousands of people packed the venue, with thousands more standing outside listening over loudspeakers. When Lombard stepped onto the stage, the roar was deafening. She waited for the applause to die down, then leaned into the microphone. "Before I say a word," she began, her voice ringing with emotion, "I want you to know I'm a Hoosier." The crowd erupted. She then led them in a stirring rendition of the national anthem and launched into a powerful, impassioned speech urging them to buy a nail for Hitler's coffin. That night, she sold over $2 million in war bonds, an astonishing figure that far exceeded anyone's expectations. Her mission was a spectacular success. She was exhausted, but exhilarated, floating on a wave of adrenaline and patriotic pride. Her work was done. The original itinerary, carefully planned for maximum safety, called for a slow 3-day train journey back to California. But Carole was impatient. She was a woman who lived her life in the fast lane, and the thought of a long, plodding train ride was unbearable. More than anything, she was desperate to get home to Pappy. She wanted to see him, to tell him about her triumph, and perhaps to finally mend the rift their pre-tour argument had caused. She wanted to fly. This decision became the focal point of a tense debate within her small group. Otto Winkler, a seasoned traveler who was deeply conscious of the risks of winter air travel, argued strenuously for the train. He was a man who followed the rules, and the plan was the train. Her mother, Bess, was even more adamantly opposed to flying. Her general fear of air travel was now amplified by a series of dark premonitions she claimed to have had throughout the trip. She begged her daughter not to get on a plane, but Lombard was a force of nature, a woman accustomed to getting her way. She was the star, the one in charge, and her desire to get home quickly overrode all objections. The popular legend, repeated for decades, is that the final decision came down to the flip of a coin. It's a dramatic, almost poetic image, a life's trajectory decided by a random spin of silver. While it's possible a coin was tossed in a moment of theatrical persuasion, the more prosaic reality is that there was no real contest. Carole wanted to fly, and so they would fly. The arrangements were made. They booked passage on Transcontinental and Western Air, or TWA, Flight 3. The aircraft was a DC-3, the workhorse of the burgeoning American airline industry, widely considered the safest and most reliable passenger plane in the world. But there was a wartime complication. Because of the urgent need to move military personnel across the country, civilian flights were often commandeered by the government. Flight 3 was no exception. It was filled with 15 young U.S. Army Air Corps pilots, leaving only a few seats available for civilian passengers. Initially, Lombard, her mother, and Winkler were told there was only room for 2. But Lombard, once again, used her immense star power. She argued that her mother and Winkler were official members of her war bond party and essential to her work. In the face of a national hero, the airline officials relented. 3 of the young servicemen were asked to give up their seats and wait for a later flight. It was a moment of terrible, unknowing irony. In her determination to keep her own party together, Carole Lombard had inadvertently saved the lives of 3 soldiers while condemning her own loved ones and herself to their doom. On the morning of January 16, 1942, Lombard, her mother, and Otto Winkler boarded the plane in Indianapolis. The flight was scheduled to take them to Burbank, California, with several refueling stops along the way. The mood was likely one of relief and happy exhaustion. Their mission was accomplished, and they were heading home. The first legs of the journey were uneventful, but as TWA Flight 3 took off from its final refueling stop in Las Vegas and headed into the pitch-black, moonless night sky, it was flying towards a chain of circumstances that would lead to absolute disaster. Ahead of them, unseen in the darkness, lay the rugged, unforgiving peaks of the Nevada desert and a fiery, violent end. A triumphant mission was complete. A nation was inspired, and a series of small, fateful choices had been made, each one narrowing the path of destiny until only one route remained. As TWA Flight 3 lifted off from Las Vegas, it was more than just an airplane. It was a vessel carrying a national hero, a beloved mother, and a devoted friend into a black, beaconless void. The stage was now set for the final, heartbreaking act. What happened in those final moments above the Nevada desert? How does a nation and a king process such a sudden and devastating loss? The story of the crash is also the story of a king's unimaginable grief and of how a star's tragic, fiery end forged a national legend that would shine on forever. As TWA Flight 3 climbed out of the bright oasis of Las Vegas on the evening of January 16, 1942, the mood on board was likely one of weary satisfaction. For Carole Lombard, her mother Bess, and Otto Winkler, a triumphant mission was complete. They were on the final leg of their journey, a short hop over the mountains to Burbank, California. They were heading home, home to the ranch, home to Pappy. In just over an hour, they would be back in the warm, familiar embrace of the life they had built. But they were flying into a changed world, a world where the familiar signposts had been deliberately removed. The darkness ahead was not just the absence of light, it was an active, man-made state of invisibility. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, the entire west coast of the United States was designated a Western Defense Zone. Fear of a Japanese air attack was rampant, and a region-wide blackout was ordered. This meant that the string of airway beacons, the rotating lights that guided pilots safely through the treacherous mountain passes, had been extinguished. For the pilots of Flight 3, Captain Wayne Williams and First Officer W.M. Gaddis. This turned a routine flight into a high-stakes exercise in navigation, relying on instruments, maps, and their own knowledge of the terrain. Captain Williams was a seasoned veteran with thousands of hours of flight time, a man who knew these routes intimately. But on this starless, moonless night, the familiar landscape below was a featureless black void. The official investigation by the Civil Aeronautics Board would later piece together the flight's final fatal minutes, for reasons that will never be known for certain. Perhaps a simple miscalculation, a faulty instrument, or a moment of disorientation in the oppressive darkness. Flight 3 drifted several miles west of its prescribed course. The flight plan called for a steady climb to 8,000 feet to clear the Spring Mountain Range. The highest peak on their intended route was well below that altitude. But on their new, deviated course, a different, more formidable obstacle lay directly in their path. The 8,300-foot sheer cliff face of Potosi Mountain, a jagged peak known locally as Double Up. Inside the cabin, the 22 souls on board would have been oblivious. The flight was smooth. Perhaps Lombard was talking with her mother, recounting the triumphs of the tour. Perhaps she was gazing out the window into the impenetrable darkness, thinking only of the moment she would see Gable again. There would have been no warning, no sudden lurch or dive, just a single, violent, and instantaneous end. At approximately 7:23 p.m., traveling at cruising speed, TWA Flight 3 slammed directly into the side of the mountain, about 200 feet below its summit. The plane, fully loaded with fuel for its short journey, disintegrated on impact, erupting into a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. The explosion was so intense that it was seen by observers in Las Vegas, over 30 miles away, a sudden horrific flash of orange against the dark silhouette of the distant peaks. In that fiery instant, Hollywood's brightest smile was extinguished. All 22 people on board were gone. Back in Hollywood, Clark Gable was waiting. He had planned a small welcome home party, a gesture of reconciliation after their fight. When the call came that his wife's flight was overdue, his first reaction was annoyance, not fear. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and then longer, annoyance curdled into a cold, creeping dread. The news finally crackled over the wire services. A TWA plane en route from Las Vegas was missing. Gable, his face a mask of disbelief, refused to accept the implications. He immediately called his closest friend, Spencer Tracy, and MGM's head of publicity and resident fixer, Eddie Mannix. Together they chartered a small plane and flew through the night to Las Vegas, a desperate flight towards a truth Gable was not ready to face. They arrived to a scene of frantic, disorganized chaos. The remote location of the crash site, high up a sheer, snow-dusted mountain, made an immediate recovery impossible. All anyone knew for sure was that a plane had gone down, and there was little hope of finding survivors. Gable was taken to the El Rancho Vegas hotel, where he began a torturous 2-day vigil. He was a man suspended between a sliver of impossible hope and an ocean of unimaginable despair. He paced the floors of his hotel room like a caged animal chain-smoking, refusing to eat or sleep. Friends who were with him said he would stare out the window for hours, his eyes fixed on the distant, silent mountain that held his wife captive. He kept repeating to anyone who would listen that she was alive, that she was a survivor, that she was just up there, injured, waiting for him. A search party composed of local miners, cowboys, and soldiers was assembled and began the arduous trek up the mountain. For 2 days, Gable waited, his sanity fraying with every passing hour. He would later be moved to a small ranch at the base of the mountain, closer to the search, closer to her. Finally, on the second day, the recovery party reached the wreckage. The scene that greeted them was one of utter, apocalyptic devastation. The plane had been atomized. The debris field was scattered across the cliff face. It was immediately horribly clear that no one could have survived. The searchers began their grim, sacred task, recovering the victims. Word was sent down the mountain. Spencer Tracy, his own face etched with grief, took on the unbearable duty of telling his best friend that all hope was lost. Gable's reaction was not a cry of sadness. It was a primal roar of pure, animalistic agony, the sound of a soul being ripped in two. In his grief-stricken state, he became fixated on one idea. He had to go up the mountain himself. He had to bring her down. The other men, including a local sheriff, had to physically restrain him, telling him that the scene was too horrific for any husband to witness. He finally collapsed, a giant of a man utterly broken by a grief so profound it seemed to eclipse the world. Later, one of the search party members came down from the mountain. He approached Gable and silently handed him something he had found near Carole's body, a pair of diamond and ruby clips, a gift from Gable a few weeks earlier. They were blackened and bent from the fire, but they were hers, the tangible proof of her presence and her absence. In that moment, the last vestiges of denial crumbled into dust. The journey back to Los Angeles was a silent funereal procession. A double funeral was held for Carole and her mother at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. Hollywood, a town often criticized for its superficiality, came to a standstill, united in genuine heartbroken grief. But for Clark Gable, the public mourning was just a distant noise. He walked through the service like a man in a trance. Afterwards, he returned to the Encino Ranch, the home they had built, now a hollow, echoing mausoleum of memories. He was alone, adrift in a sea of her absence. Carole Lombard's death resonated far beyond the gates of Hollywood. She was declared the first American woman killed in the line of duty in World War II. President Roosevelt sent a personal, heartfelt letter to Gable, posthumously awarding her the Medal of Freedom and calling her a gallant soldier who died in the service of her country. The U.S. Maritime Commission announced it would name a new Liberty ship, the SS Carole Lombard. Her final tragic act of patriotism had an immeasurable impact, transforming her from a beloved entertainer into a revered national hero, a martyr for the cause she so passionately believed in. Her death made the war deeply personal for millions of Americans, a sacrifice that brought the cost of freedom into sharp, painful focus. For Clark Gable, there was only one path forward. Haunted by their final angry words and by her last playful telegram, "Hey, Pappy, you better get in this man's army," he decided to honor her last wish. In August 1942, at the absolute height of his fame, the 41-year-old king of Hollywood walked away from his multi-million-dollar career and enlisted as a private in the U.S. Army Air Forces. It was an act of penance, an escape, and perhaps a search for oblivion. He trained as an aerial gunner and officer and was eventually stationed in England, flying combat missions over Nazi Germany in a B-17 Flying Fortress. The men who flew with him said he was fearless to the point of being reckless, seemingly possessing a death wish. He was seeking out the danger that had claimed his wife, but fate, in its final cruel twist, allowed him to survive. He returned home a decorated war hero, but the man who came back was not the one who had left. He returned to Hollywood, but the king's throne was empty. The easy charm, the swagger, the famous world-conquering grin. It was all an act now, a ghost of the man he once was. Friends said the light had simply gone out of him. He would marry twice more and have a son. But those who knew him best, like Spencer Tracy, maintained that he never ever got over Carole. He had loved other women, but she had been the love of his life, his soulmate. The ranch they had shared became his prison. He sold it, only to buy it back, unable to live with the memories, but unable to live without them either. When Clark Gable died of a heart attack in November 1960, his final wishes were clear and non-negotiable. He was not to be buried in a grand tomb befitting the King of Hollywood. Instead, at his specific instruction, he was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the same marble crypt right beside his one true love. The inscription was simple, but it said everything. Clark Gable, it read on one side. Carole Lombard Gable on the other. Ma and Pa, finally, and forever, together again. In the end, the story of Carole Lombard is a story about light, the dazzling, chaotic light of her talent, which illuminated the darkest days of the Depression, the warm, steady light of her love for Clark Gable, a love that felt real and true in a world of make-believe, and the fierce, patriotic light of her final days, a light that shone as an example of service and sacrifice. She was a woman who lived with a ferocious, unapologetic joy, who loved with her whole heart, and who died for a cause she believed in with her whole soul. Her legacy is not the tragedy of her death, but the vibrancy of her life. She remains the undisputed Queen of Screwball, the prototype of the funny, smart, and independent one who was nobody's fool. She left behind a body of work that continues to bring laughter to new generations. But more than that, she left behind the story of a life lived to the absolute fullest. She flew across the country on a mission of love for her nation, a queen rallying her people. And she fell from the sky in a blaze of fire, becoming a timeless symbol of the beautiful, heartbreaking intersection of glamour and duty. She was and always will be Hollywood's brightest smile.